Have you ever wondered what goes through a man's mind when he knows exactly when he will die? On January 18, 2005, Donald Beardslee woke up in his prison cell at San Quentin State Prison. It was a cold Wednesday morning, and by the end of the night, California would carry out its first execution in nearly 4 years. Beardslee was not a typical death row inmate. Decades earlier, in 1969, he had already served time for one murder, only to be released and commit 2 more. Now he spent over 2 decades on death row. But in those final 24 hours, did he feel fear, remorse, or simply nothing? As the clock ticked down to midnight, would this convicted killer finally confront the weight of his choices? This is the final 24 hours of Donald Beardslee. As we look back on Donald Beardslee's final day, it's important to understand the life that led him here, the man behind the crimes shaped by a troubled past. Donald Beardslee was born in 1943 in St. Louis, Missouri. He was the oldest of 3 children. When Donald was just 11 years old, his father died. This loss hit the family hard. At age 15, Donald was sent to Western Military Academy in Alton, Illinois. It was a strict military school. Later, he went back to St. Louis and finished high school at Southwest High School, graduating in June 1962. Shortly after, in August 1962, 19-year-old Donald joined the U.S. Air Force. He served as an aircraft mechanic for 4 years, but trouble soon followed. In 1965, he and another airman were caught trying to steal a vehicle. For this, Donald was sentenced to a work farm in Minnesota. While there, an accident changed everything. A tree fell on him, fracturing his skull. He slipped into a coma that lasted for days. The injury left a mark on his life, both physically and mentally. This troubled past would only be the beginning of a much darker journey. But even then, few could have predicted the violence that lay ahead. In 1969, Donald Beardslee's life took a dark and violent turn. One night, he met a woman named Laura Griffin in a bar in Missouri. They drank and danced together, sharing what might have seemed like an ordinary night. But when the night ended, Beardslee went home with her, and that night would change everything. He killed Laura in a brutal way. He choked her, stabbed her, and then drowned her. The crime was shocking and left the community reeling. There was no clear reason given. Beardslee never explained why he did it. Soon after, Beardslee turned himself in. He confessed to killing Laura. However, he showed no signs of remorse. His face was cold, emotionless. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 19 years in prison. He served 7 years and was released on parole in 1977. After his release on parole, Donald tried to turn things around. He attended the College of San Mateo, but freedom did not change him. Just 4 years later, while still on parole, Beardslee was involved in another horrific crime, this time in California. On April 5, 1981, 2 young women, Patty Gettling, who was 19, and Stacy Benjamin, who was 23, were found murdered in Redwood City. By the time Donald Beardslee stood trial for these murders, the courtroom already knew one thing. This was not his first killing. The killings were tied to a drug deal gone wrong. Prosecutors said a debt of $185 had gone unpaid. Beardslee's roommate, Ricarda Sue Soria, was involved. She was part of a scheme led by a drug dealer named Frank Rutherford. Soria lured the 2 women to the apartment under false pretenses. Before the women arrived, Beardslee sent Soria out to buy duct tape. The tape would be used to bind the victims. When Patty and Stacy came to the apartment, Beardslee and another man, Bill Forrester, were waiting. Prosecutors said Beardslee and Forrester shot Patty Gettling. Later, Beardslee slashed Stacy Benjamin's throat in a savage attack. Police found Beardslee's phone number near Patty's body. When officers contacted him, Beardslee confessed to the murders. He even led them to Stacy's body. At this point, he was still on parole for the murder in Missouri, which meant the state could seek the death penalty against him as a repeat offender. The trial was slow and painful. Family members of the victim sat through every details. Beardslee's cold and emotionless demeanor haunted everyone involved. He did not show much feeling during interviews or court appearances. Prison records painted a picture of a man who struggled to express emotions. Some even believed he suffered from schizophrenia. Frank Rutherford, the drug dealer behind the plan, was sentenced to life without parole and died in prison years later. Ricarda Soria pleaded no contest to second-degree murder in exchange for her testimony against Rutherford and Beardslee. She received a sentence of 15 years to life and was released on parole in 2015. Bill Forrester was acquitted, and charges against a fifth person were dropped before the trial began. In the end, Donald Beardslee was convicted of first-degree murder for the killings of Patty and Stacy. The court sentenced him to death. But the jury saw something else, a pattern. A man who had killed without clear reason, a man who never asked for forgiveness, a man who, when found by police, confessed not out of guilt but with eerie detachment. In the end, the verdict was unanimous. The judge's voice did not shake as he delivered the sentence. Death, it was the ultimate punishment, and for the victims' families, perhaps the only justice left. From that moment on, he would sit in a small cell on San Quentin's death row, waiting for the day when the state of California would carry out the sentence. But death would not come quickly. Years passed. Beardslee's lawyers filed appeals. They claimed the original trial was flawed, that his defense had not been strong enough. They argued again that his mental state made him unfit for execution, that his brain, damaged by injury, made him incapable of fully understanding what he had done. But court after court rejected those arguments. Behind thick prison walls, Donald Beardslee aged. With every denied appeal, the date drew closer. Donald Beardslee was scheduled to die on January 19, 2005. His final 24 hours had begun. At 6 o'clock in the morning on January 18, 2005, the lights woke Donald Beardslee. He'd spent more than 2 decades on San Quentin's death row, but today was different. The clock had run out. Guards entered his cell, and the official warrant for execution was read aloud, just as California's strict procedure requires. Each word weighed heavily against the echoing clank of keys. Beardslee didn't flinch. He remained seated on the edge of his bed, holding the only item he had asked to keep that morning, his personal Bible. The old book was worn, the spine bent from use. He opened it slowly, turning each page with deliberate care. No one knows what passage he read. No one asked. After an hour, he was offered breakfast, but this wasn't about choice. It was prison protocol, a plain meal, coffee, eggs, toast, a reminder that morning routines still persisted, even in the shadow of death. He picked at the eggs slowly, methodically. Every bite was deliberate. By 8 o'clock, the chaplain arrived at his cell door. They spoke quietly, a prayer, a few words, and brief. Beardslee nodded when asked if he would like a blessing. No tears fell. He didn't write a final statement. His silence was his choice. Perhaps it was reflection, or perhaps, as some suspected, he had made peace long ag, not with the world, but with whatever waited for him beyond it. By mid-morning, the guards noted he had barely moved, still holding the Bible, still calm, still waiting. As the clock neared 12 noon, Donald Beardslee remained in his cell, alone with Scripture and whatever thoughts he refused to share. By 12 noon, the sun was high over San Quentin State Prison, but inside the stone walls, the air was heavy. Time felt like it had thickened. Donald Beardslee had now been moved from his East Block cell to a death watch cell, just steps away from the execution chamber. The room was small, stark, clinical, no more than a holding pen for the final hours of a man's life. There was no clock on the wall, but he didn't need one. He knew. Beardslee spent most of the afternoon in silence. At 1 o'clock, a corrections officer appeared at the door with a metal tray. It was the same standard meal served to every inmate on the block. The tray was placed just inside. Beardslee looked at it for a long time. Then, quietly, he pushed it aside. He did not eat. He hadn't spoken much since sunrise, not to the guards, not to the staff. He had become a figure of few words. His emotions, if they existed, were kept behind a locked door. By 2 o'clock, the prison grew tense. Execution day was a machine, every minute pre-scheduled. The fourth team was already gathering in the nearby medical room. The witness list was being finalized. Every action was recorded. Nothing was left to chance. Moments later, he was joined by his legal team. These were the last faces tied to his defense, people who had argued for his life in courtrooms, filed appeals, cited case law, and tried to convince judges and governors to look again. Now they were waiting for the final decision, final hope from Governor. They sat with him behind a glass partition. The conversations were quiet, private, a few final exchanges between client and counsel, some procedural, some personal. Not long after, a female spiritual advisor arrived. She was allowed to spend time with him in person. The guards gave them space. She had visited him before, over the years, in the long waits between hearings and verdicts. But today was different. Today she was there to help guide him through the last stretch of a road he could no longer turn back from. They sat across from each other in the bare room. At times she spoke. At times it was silent. However, later staff noted that Beardslee actually seemed in good spirits. Todd Slosek, a spokesman for the Department of Corrections, would later say the condemned man had been laughing and joking around with his legal team and his spiritual advisor. But as the hours passed, his mood darkened. He grew quiet, a little apprehensive, as anyone would be who is facing death. By 5 o'clock that evening, Donald Beardslee's fate was sealed. Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger denied clemency, and the U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final 2 appeals, one challenging the jury instructions in his trial, and the other claiming California's lethal injection process was flawed. A final plea for a 120-day delay was also denied. The green phone stayed silent. There would be no stay of execution. At 7:42 p.m., Beardslee declined his final meal. So he was offered the standard dinner, served to inmates, chili macaroni, mixed vegetables, and green salad, but he refused it, just as he had earlier declined the option of a personalized last meal. The only thing he asked for was a cup of grapefruit juice, which he sipped slowly. From that point on, the clock ticked loudly. Outside the prison compound, the night air was heavy with tension. Nearly 300 protesters gathered, their faces lit by the flickering glow of candles. They stood in silent vigil, holding signs that read, "Don't kill in our name" and "Stop state murder." Among them was a lone supporter of the death penalty, carrying a sign that simply said, "Bye bye Beardslee." And inside, the death chamber was prepared. The straps were checked. Witnesses were called and seated behind the thick glass. And in the cell, Beardslee waited. No TV, no phone calls, no final letter, just silence. Midnight approached. It was time. At 11:58 p.m., the heavy door to the death chamber groans open. Donald Beardslee steps forward, accompanied by 5 guards. He was 61 years old, tall and pale, his face gaunt from age and isolation. He wore a short-sleeved blue shirt, blue cotton prison pants, and silver wire-frame glasses. His hair was neatly slicked back, with gray streaks at the temples. His wild beard and mane from the mugshot decades ago were long gone. Now he resembled a quiet professor rather than a man convicted of 3 brutal murders. He walked with no visible resistance. For a fleeting moment, something flashed across his face. Anxious concern, maybe fear. But then it disappeared, swallowed by the same flat, unreadable expression that had carried him through the long years on death row. Inside the death chamber, it was silent, sterile, and cold with ceremony. Against the pale green walls, the gurney sat in the center, angled so witnesses behind the thick glass can see everything. The guards helped him lie down on the hospital-style gurney. They strapped his ankles, chest, and arms tightly. Beardslee closed his eyes, appearing almost asleep, but his breathing was steady, controlled. Behind the glass, 30 witnesses were watching. 13 journalists, 17 others, family members, lawyers, officials, and the brother of one of the women he killed. The guards then began the difficult task of finding veins suitable for the lethal injection. From midnight to 12:16 a.m., they carefully searched, their lips tight with concentration. Beardslee did not move a muscle during those long minutes. Once the intravenous lines were finally taped to his arms, Beardslee was left alone in the chamber, waiting for the chemicals that would end his life. At exactly 12:18 a.m., Beardslee's chest heaved with 2 quick sighs, a subtle release of tension. At the same moment, unseen hands began sending the poison through the plastic tubes into his veins. It was as if he was saying, "Okay, let's get on with it." His eyelids fluttered open briefly. 2 minutes later, he yawned and smacked his lips twice. From that moment on, the execution followed a familiar pattern seen in previous lethal injections at San Quentin. His face shifted from a flushed red to a deep grayish blue. His breathing slowed, then stopped completely. Not a single muscle twitched. At 12:29 a.m., the execution was declared over. It had taken 16 minutes longer than most executions, but 1 minute shorter than the last lethal injection at San Quentin in 2002, when Stephen Wayne Anderson was put to death. For those watching through the thick glass, the minutes dragged on, heavy with tension and silence. The atmosphere was charged yet still, broken only by nervous coughs and shifting feet. Across the observation room, a woman in a red coat folded her arms tightly to her chest, occasionally clasping her hands in prayer. Nearby, another woman bit her lip, clenched her fists, and once fiercely pressed a knuckle to her mouth. As the guards announced Beardslee's death, the woman with the knotted hands doubled over, gasping. When it was over, Amundsen looked up briefly and nodded to the press. "I saw what I wanted to see. I'm glad. He was awful. He deserved to die." As the news of Donald Beardslee's execution spread outside San Quentin, a wave of reactions quickly rippled through the public and media. Television stations interrupted their regular programming to announce the grim event. News channels flashed headlines, "Donald Beardslee executed at San Quentin," marking him as the 11th person put to death in California since the state resumed executions in 1992, and the first execution since January 2002. Social media and phone lines buzzed with responses, some expressing relief that justice had been served, while others voiced concerns over the death penalty and the finality of the state's action. Amid the heated reactions, urgent calls and emails poured into Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger's office, urging him to reconsider the decision and grant clemency to Beardslee. Supporters of clemency highlighted issues around mental health, legal representation, and the ongoing debate about capital punishment. So what do you think, LK? Was justice truly served? Did Beardslee die as a monster, or as a man shaped by violence and failure? Let us know in the comments. If this story made you reflect, Consider subscribing for more true crime stories that explore not just what happened, but why.